After having built an enormous reputation with the release of two of the most celebrated Sonic fan games of all time, Sonic before and after the sequel, developer Lake Feppard burst onto the indie game scene in 2017 with the release of his first original title, Spark the Electric Jester. A fast-paced 2D platformer inspired by the likes of Sonic and Mega Man X, Spark was warmly received by Sonic fans and fans of 2D platformers alike. However, in just 2 years, Feppard Games have taken a quantum leap forward with the release of Spark the Electric Jester 2, a surprisingly polished 3D high-speed platformer beat-em-up that is sure to cure the itch of many Sonic fans looking for a Sonic Adventure formula revival, albeit with an additional focus on combat. Following the quest of Fark, the mechanical doppelganger to the titular Spark, who strangely doesn't make an actual appearance in this game, the player seeks the character's true name and origins. At the cusp of discovering the answers from one Dr. Armstrong, a mysterious, edgy-looking Fark duplicate known as EJ appears to kidnap the Doctor, sending Fark on a journey that will take him to a myriad of diverse locations and pit him against distinctive opponents. Spark 2 definitely wears its gameplay inspirations on its sleeve, with speed-based platforming directly based on the Sonic Adventure titles, and combat strongly reminiscent to fast, flashy beat-em-ups like the Devil May Cry series and Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance. The gameplay feels all at once familiar, but distinctive in terms of its pairing. For the most part, you'll be in Sonic mode, speeding through what are for the most part linear tracks that will diverge and reconverge along the way, with enemies of varying degrees of strength scattered along the levels that you must dispatch. Like Sonic, you'll be powering through loops, corkscrews, and perfecting aerial acrobatics to make your way through over a dozen different levels, each with their own aesthetics and various gimmicks. Unlike Sonic, however, little of Spark 2 falls into the automation trap that many 3D Sonic titles do. Fark will only on very rare occasions not be under the player's direct control. Direct input is essential to success, as loops and vertical paths are traversed mainly by the character's own power alone, and failing to pay attention will often end in failure. However, rarely will failing one of these skill tests result in death. Due to the lack of automation, you will almost always have an opportunity to recover and maybe even find a resultant path that will lead to collectibles or even an opportunity to bypass the main path of the level. Players will, on more than one occasion, if zipping out of a loop, find themselves being able to circle back and finding hidden bits on the outside of the loop, encouraging more attention to be paid to the surroundings than simply what lies directly ahead. Understanding the levels will give the player more opportunities to take advantage of the level's geometry, by obtaining more momentum through skilled play to obtain access to alternate routes, allowing for a high degree of speedrunning potential as well as replayability. Using Fark's abilities like his basic boost as well as his more powerful charge boost makes for a surprisingly nuanced moveset, allowing for a very rewarding skill set mastery curve that can lead to shockingly speedy times depending on how creatively they are employed. This speedrunning mentality is necessary for unlocking the medals in each stage, by earning as high of a score as possible. High scores aren't only achieved through fast times, however. The other half of the gameplay, combat, is just as important to achieving high scores. Like Devil May Cry and Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance, Fark has both a light and heavy attack, the latter of which can be charged up for a stronger blow. Filling the energy gauge by dealing damage as well as utilizing well-timed parrying will allow for a special attack to be triggered to more effectively defeat enemies. In addition to his default moveset, Fark can also discover 5 alternate combat items, which will change his damage output and style. Like its inspirations, Spark 2 allows for seamless transitioning between the combat styles and their corresponding light and heavy attacks. However, unlike those other titles, less emphasis is placed on flashy, distinctive combos to rack up points, and more on dispatching enemies by any means necessary, meaning that the player could easily stick to their preferred style with little real need to experiment once they find their flow. Because of this, and the heavier emphasis on forward movement than going out of your way to fight, Spark 2's combat, while still comparatively straightforward, still feels a bit unnecessarily over-designed for the type of gameplay experience that's offered here, which is especially noticeable in the boss encounters, which ultimately boils down to spamming the heavy attack while paying attention to the enemy's parry prompts. That's not to say it never stops being fun, however, as the fights never outstay their welcome, and being able to down enemies effectively while avoiding taking damage can be very rewarding upon mastery of the mechanics. Spark 2's gameplay is an absolute joy to experience. Mechanics mesh with level design in a way that's complementary and never drags on too long. Each stage is perfectly timed to end before becoming tedious, and each area holds enough distinct hazards and set pieces that each one feels distinct from the others. This is especially helped by the fact that as the game moves along, the stages become more robust both in design and how the player interacts with it, avoiding the general trap of having a great first impression and falling off in the middle. This game starts with an excellent first impression, but continues to outdo itself up until the end. That said, not all of the levels are perfect, especially the last 2 stages, which start resorting to spamming enemies and attacks to a slightly annoying degree. Those small nitpicks aside, however, the player is sure to be in for a thrilling roller coaster ride. Spark 2 excels in many regards in its presentation, while struggling with several others. Stages are bright and colorful with vibrant pastel colors and flat cartoony aesthetics that keep stages enjoyable to watch fly by at blistering speeds. While a few of the early stages do tend to blend together aesthetically and can in places feel somewhat sparse and lifeless, as the game progresses, each stage becomes more and more distinctive with its own sense of identity. This is further bolstered by a fantastic soundtrack that features a satisfying combination of techno and rock that perfectly fits the high-tempo gameplay and is perfectly tailored to each locale it represents. Small flourishes, like having the vocals fade in during a boss fight as the enemy's health is whittled down to a specific degree, do a great job of hyping the player up, with a kind of butt rock that would make Crush 40 proud. A lot of the Sonic influence can be felt in the Spark 2 soundtrack, and specific stage tracks in conjunction with the level's aesthetics intentionally pay homage to some of Sonic's more well-known 3D outings, like Sonic Adventure 2, Sonic Heroes, and even Sonic Unleashed towards the end. Somewhat less impressive, however, are the in-game sound effects. Even when turning up the sound effects in the options menu, the various in-game sounds lack punch, leaving the audio landscape feeling a little more flat than it would otherwise. Attacks don't feel quite as satisfying to land as a result, and simple actions like bouncing off of a spring or collecting bits feel just slightly hollow. Sound effects aside, when it comes to being an appealing world to see and listen to, Spark 2 nails it. Where the game stumbles a bit more, however, is the narrative department. Spark 2 is light on story by design. While there are several callbacks to the events of the first game, new players shouldn't have too much of a problem following the broad strokes of the events that unfold. Despite there not being too much story, however, the story that is there feels a little underbaked. The dialogue has a few high points, but by and large doesn't leave much of an impression. There's no voice dialogue in Spark 2, which, due to the nature of being a relatively light platformer, shouldn't be an issue. However, some of the darker elements of the plot make the lack of voice acting almost feel like a glaring omission at times. Along with this, despite a relatively small cast of characters, the game's short runtime doesn't allow the more dramatic turns that the game takes with certain characters' arcs to feel fully fleshed out. This, coupled with an ending that leaves a few too many confusing plot lines left dangling, results in a narrative that could have done with a little more finesse to bring it up to par with the game's stellar gameplay experience. Spark 2 is a short game. First-time players can expect an experience clocking in at just over 3 hours for an initial casual playthrough, though additional objectives like collecting floppy disks containing concept art and returning to stages to speedrun for medals, as well as challenge modes that are unlocked after playing through the game's story at least once, could easily double or triple the game's playtime. The game is also relatively easy. If you've ever played a 3D Sonic game or 3D beat 'em up, you'll likely settle right into its familiar control schemes rather quickly. You will die in Spark 2, but not to a frustrating degree, though the later stages can get a bit cheap with the projectile and laser hazards. This is in part due to Spark 2 not having a life system, making it easy to try again until you overcome the obstacles in your way, in conjunction with a generous checkpoint system. The only penalty exacted on players for dying several times in a row is losing whichever combat item you currently had equipped, requiring you either find it again somewhere in the stage, or purchasing it with the bits you've collected in the stages from the store in the map screen. A minor inconvenience at most. Hard mode does exist for some extra challenge, however besides increasing the enemy's damage output, the added challenge is somewhat marginal. Challenge does exist, however, in the additional tour modes available at the map screen upon completing the story. These modes enforce specific challenges, like a boss rush mode with limited stock, or completing all the stages without dying, which will definitely test players of all skill levels. Spark 2 is shockingly refined for a game that was developed by only a single person. While playing this game for review, I only encountered one major technical hiccup besides occasionally wonky camera when getting near certain walls or respawning after a checkpoint. That issue was at the final boss, where the game presented me with a black screen and a glitched UI. Though the audio was still playing, and Fark still seemed to react to the controller input. This happened despite restarting the stage and quitting to the menu, but closing out of the game and completely restarting it seemed to fix the issue. Spark 2 is a joy of a game. Fans of Sonic's adventure formula titles have a lot to love here, with a game that harkens back to the adventure title's strengths while also alleviating some of their weaknesses. Even if a player comes to Spark 2 with no Sonic experience, it does enough right that it stands on its own merits as a distinctive, enjoyable experience. While the flow of the game doesn't quite gel with the depth of the combat system, and the game itself is definitely on the shorter side, it remains a refined, tight package that doesn't outstay its welcome, with an outstanding soundtrack and memorable levels. A weak story takes away from it slightly, but despite this, the strength of its gameplay alone is more than enough reason to drop the $20 in order to give it a shot. When it comes to fast-paced action, Spark 2 does not disappoint. And if the monumental jump from Spark 1 to Spark 2 is any indication, there are very, very good things in store for the Spark series on the horizon when Spark 3 rolls around. But for now, that's all I've got. Have a good one.